Episode 15. Yep, you heard that right. The 15th episode of the Connect the Dots NYC podcast. If you're new here, welcome. This is where we chat with changemakers from all over the world to learn how to make real, lasting impact in this ever changing world. So grab your favorite snack and get ready, because this one's going to be a banger. Thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. Mauricio Miller is a social innovator, author, and founder of the Center for Peer Driven Change, a global collaborative that empowers residents to lead their own solutions to poverty and inequality. A MacArthur Genius Fellow, a Ashoka Fellow, and the recipient of the Schwab Award for Social Innovation, Mauricio has spent his career reimagining how society supports low income communities by shifting trust and resources directly to the people themselves. Before founding the center, he created the groundbreaking Family Independence Initiative, which challenged traditional charity models by proving that families thrive when given the chance to build on their own strengths and networks. His insights, shaped by his experience as the son of a single mother and as an engineer turned reformer, are captured in his acclaimed book, The Alternative. Most of what you believe about poverty is wrong. Mauricio has served on President Obama's White House Council for Community Solutions. He has been honored at President Clinton's State of the Union and taught at both Princeton University and UC Berkeley. Today, through the Center for Peer Driven Change, he continues to champion a radical but simple idea that sustainable social change begins when we trust everyday people to drive it. Thank you so much for joining me today, and welcome, Mauricio Miller.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
So I want to get started with your origins and the motivation. And so you've spoken often about your mother's influence on your work. How did her experiences shape your understanding of poverty and self-determination?
So my story does start with, of course, my family. And my mother was a single mom. My older sister, and I had been struggling in a border town with Mexico. And so she decided that opportunities were going to be in America. And so she put us on a Greyhound bus and we moved to San Jose, California. And even though she had a third grade education, she was really talented. She was hardworking, and stereotype had been that if you come to America and you work really hard, you can make it. But things didn't go like that well. So my sister ended in trouble, and then I was the youngest one, and then I was supposed to be able to take the American dream and somehow build a life that could take care of my sister, and I think take care of her was the hope. But as I said, somehow or other, America did not quite recognize that this Mexican single mom with no money somehow was smart and actually could actually add to our economy. And so she ran into a lot of stereotypes that exist and continue to exist. And so the opportunities were never there. And as my sister's life became more troubled, because she got pregnant at 16 and her husband, the guy, took her away and would beat her up. And my mother was going crazy. And so what she did when I was 10 or 11 or something like that, she got her finger and pointed it at me and said, Mauricio, this cannot continue to happen. You have to be able to go to college, and then you have to do something to make sure that your sister and her kids get taken care of. And this doesn't happen to other families. Now, I'm a 10 or 11-year-old kid, mother that's basically very determined that this can't happen, and a very strong sense of justice. And I learned so much from her, and I knew that my role was supposed to be to do better. And somehow or other, she and my sister both sacrificed everything for one kid to go to college, and they pointed, and somehow or other, I ending up as an. She told me I had to be an engineer or a doctor because I had to make money. There was no choice in this. Your role is you have to make some money and take care of this. And I ended up at UC, and I decided to become an engineer, which I had no idea what they did. But I didn't want to be a doctor because too many people would die. So I did go to Berkeley, graduated as an engineer, and then I was able to then start taking care of my family. So that was the start of this whole thing.
And like you mentioned, you began as an engineer at UC Berkeley before leading social service agencies. And so, what led you from engineering to social innovation and community change?
So what ended up happening is that now I obviously had my life together. My sister's life was still a mess. My mother's health had deteriorated because there is no health care, universal health care in the United States. And in order to save money for me to go to college, she would take jobs that did not have health, which paid more so she could save more. And so she basically gave up her health. And now that I was an engineer, I'm over there, no, mom, no, you have the options you need, and I afford it now, and you will make sure you get your operations. And she said, no, I didn't give my health so that you put all your time in taking care of me. You're supposed to do this other thing, right? And so we tried to argue, and I would argue. And one day she stopped arguing, and I thought on the argument, and I went to spend some money for her to be with me that I could take care of her. And it was very strange that that I had won an argument with this very determined woman. But one weekend, she said going to Las Vegas, and this is in the book, so it's something that is was difficult for me to share. But she went to Las Vegas, and she bought a gun and she shot herself. And it was I learned about it at 4 a.m. from a policeman, and in some ways, I knew that I had lost the argument. She was not gonna let me spend money on her, and so she stepped aside, and, um, I'd have to say that traumatized me quite a bit, and, I was on my way to leaving engineering to do what I wanted to do, but I just lost my mother, and that sacrificed everything for me. And so as I thought about becoming a designer, I'm over there. No, this is when the war on poverty was really getting going. And so what I did is I quit going into design, which is what I wanted, and I joined a nonprofit, hoping to actually start acting on a promise that she made me make when I was 10 or 11 years old, that I stop all this BS that's happening. So, so that was sort of the beginning of it. I got into a nonprofit within a couple years, I became CEO. And of course, my reason for joining it was to have an impact on the poverty issue that affected my mother and my sister and so many of our friends and colleagues and stuff. So I the programs that I had, and we came to have a huge reputation. And so I got invited by President Clinton to his 99 State of the Union address. And because we were supposed to have some of the best services in the country, but what had happened is that by then, which is late 1990s, I'd come to realize that they weren't good. And it was really clear to me because my nephew and nieces watching their mother get beat up and everything, um, they became insecure. We were dealing with drugs and all that happens when a family's struggling. And then I realized I wouldn't bring my own nephew and nieces through my services, and they were considered some of the best services in the country. And it's like, well, why? It's like, well, now that I'm middle income and I have choices, I want to use the system that is used by the privilege, which is that service provider has to meet my needs. They have to please me as the client or the customer. But my services were the other way around. That if somebody my services, the customer had to meet my eligibility and needs. And so that wasn't what I wanted for my nephew and nieces. And probably the most troubling thing is that I knew that my mother would not be proud of me, that she would not come to my services. She would always say that the people that are trying to be helpful in trying to do that, they would take her pride away. And she survived on pride. We all survived on pride and self-respect. And so there I am in the State of the Union address, sitting watching the president and realizing this is BS. I should, if this is the best that there is in this country, something is totally wrong. And I was getting very depressed. And so that started me rethinking that this is like 1999, 2000, that there is something fundamental with the system that I had just gone into.
And obviously out of that drive and out of that passion for social change that came from, both the loss that you experienced, the background that you had, but also the State of the Union address by President Clinton, you created the Center for Peer Driven Change. And I want to explore the philosophy behind that, because your work centers on trusting residents to lead their own change. And so, why do you believe peer networks are more effective than traditional aid systems?
So, for 20 years, like most people, I thought that structuring something uh, was going to be the way to expand it. In other words, you test it out here, and I tested it out in the Bay Area, and we tried replicating my programs. If we were the best, why not replicate them and whatever? But they weren't sticking. But the other piece that was really fascinating to me is that, I'd come to neighborhoods here in the Bay Area that I knew really well, and I knew the people there, and I could relate because I came from that type of neighborhood. And I started realizing that the people that did that, when I looked at success stories in these neighborhoods, they were the people that did not come to programs. And so I became really curious as to, well, how come things are working over there. And one of the experiences that I had early on in doing social services is we work with gang kids, youth and refugees and whatever that were in a lot of trouble. But in particular, there was an initiative around graduation that at that point in time, at McClymonds High School here in Oakland, that less than half of the kids were graduating from high school. And so then, on a panel, there were all these people talking about here's a problem with this and gangs and all of this. And we have to, even though we'd been doing services to these high school students for at least 10 years that I was involved, that nothing was really changing. And we obviously don't understand it well enough. And it came to me to talk about it. I said, well, I've been doing this for a long time and we've been trying to see the problems. I think we're looking on the wrong side of the coin here. What I'm curious, almost 50% of the kids at McClymonds do graduate and they live under the same circumstances as everybody else. So how is it that they make it? And maybe that's what we should be learning. And that came from my mother. When we moved into a neighborhood, what she would do is she would kind of scour the neighborhood and she would realize that there were some houses at the end of the block. He says you cannot, associate with them. Yeah, because they're just going to give you trouble. But then she would find the people that were more in your situation with us. They didn't have to be a single mom, but somebody struggling who really were kind of facing the same circumstances, but that had some success. And she would look at that success, and that would be the role model. So she would bring and introduce us to their house and whatever. And that's how I learned that it was possible to start being very poor and end up in college. So it was that role that had always stuck with me. And here I'm on a panel of we're trying to understand why the hell all these kids are not graduating. And for 10 years, we'd been looking on the wrong side. And I'm over there, no, I want to research the other side. And a lot of how that modified my approach working with youth and whatever is part of the reason I got Clinton's. I got better results.
And how do you respond to critics who argue that communities can't always self organize without institutional or structural support?
Well, in many ways, that happens because we tell them, wait till the time comes to save you. Yeah, so it's like, if we're the ones with resources, connections, we have solutions. I went to Princeton. I can develop apps for you. I can, so it's really fascinating, for the people that are in a privileged position. I was now in a privileged position. Society constantly tells you that you're the leader. And not only that, it tells you that those people like my mother and our neighbors can't do it. You know, here they can do anything they want to do. And yet, look at, they're not getting ahead. So obviously, it's their fault. Obviously, we have to come save them. And even though it's a very subtle message, that message always gets hammered into my Princeton students, my Berkeley students, wherever you go to college. It is the privileged that really are supposed to have the solutions. And the residents, like my mother, who knew exactly what she wanted to do, who would plan, who sacrificed, and my sister and our neighbors were never seen as creative, never seen as innovative, never seen as resourceful, and yet they survived on almost nothing. They were the most resourceful people I've ever seen, and they could actually do it. And nobody was going to tell my mother how to raise her child. And so it was obvious to me that the only solutions was that were actually owned by the residents themselves. And so I had to go to that. And I'll try to get to that, where you could actually trust families in the system that even the one tended fundamentally distrust the very people they target to help. That in a system like that, it's telling you that those people aren't capable, that they can't make decisions. And we'll cover it by saying, oh, but we feel sorry for them. They've had to do this and that and whatever. In feeling sorry for them, that's what my mother did the most. When people realize she's a single mom from Mexico, they would try to give her clothes and then they try to give her money. And oh my God, she'd come home so sad. And it's like, they think just a charity. They think I can't think. They think they're smarter than me. And because such nice people, she could argue with them. She couldn't push back because they were so nice. And in many ways, I think Martin Luther King ended up in the same place when he wrote the letters from Birmingham jail, I believe. He said the problem wasn't the racists or the most bigoted or whatever, because they could fight them. It was clear what the distinction was. The problem he was having was the well-intended priests and everything like that wanted to be helpful, but were patronizing. And that's what my programs were. They were patronizing. And that's why my mother would never have gone through that. And it was then the challenge was, how can you build and what role do institutions have in actually not disempowering, but empowering people like my mother and our neighbors?
And so to kind of almost summarize one of your last points, do you believe one of the most understood ideas about poverty is that the solution involves us patronizing those that are impoverished?
Well, that's the way the system is set up. Philanthropists, government, and whatever. And it comes from the fact that structures are actually necessary when people are in crisis. So when my sister got beat up and she had 3 kids and had to run away, welfare was really important. She got beat up and it would take her days to recover, and she had to feed her kids. The welfare and crisis management and whatever, that was really important. But within a week, my sister would gather her wits, start getting together, and start planning how to then support her kids. Her husband wouldn't let her finish high school or ever take a job that earned him. And so it was really difficult for her, even though she had the pride to do it and was willing to work really hard. The system actually just classified her as a charity case. And as soon as she took welfare, then it sort of validated for all the helpers that, she was incapable. But it was only during crisis. So the dilemma ends up that we don't make a distinction between crisis, which requires government and institutions, and then people actually taking the lead and putting their family together to actually improve their own community. But there was another nuance that is really important, which is initially started this project with the Family Independence Initiative, which the focus was on family. Obviously, I knew my family. And so in that scenario, then it was that families exactly could do it. But as time went on, I start learning is that it is actually really difficult. America actually does provide some of the best environment for people that are very poor. That's why people keep coming here. It does. But it's far, far from perfect or even good. I mean, I'm sorry. America has the basis to be really a wonderful place. It attracts so many people, migrants, immigrants, people from different countries and whatever, that are like my mother and her friends, very resourceful, very talented. And somehow or other, we don't take advantage of that. We really try to then patronize them. And it looks like then they are charity cases and drags on society. Instead, they can add to it. Mother wanted to have a dress shop. She could create jobs. She was a wonderful seamstress and designer. But there was no system that would recognize people that these talents be, because somehow or other we didn't have a system that could recognize it, and found that that system, however, does exist, and that exists for the privileged. It's fascinating teaching at Berkeley and Princeton. So coming into those institutions, then there is a message that every freshman and that every year and every day that Princeton sends to its students, and that is that you are the future. You are the leaders. You can figure it out. That you need to create. You need to innovate. You need to do what you're best at. And that we're here to be a supportive environment. In this environment, you can learn. You can take whatever classes you want. You can actually get resources to experiment. You can fail. It's okay. You learn from failures. There's a message there of capability. So as soon as you get into an institution like that, there's this really supportive environment. And my mother, and when I grew up, living in low-income neighborhoods and even having programs and whatever, did not send that message at all. They would send the message of, if you fit eligibility criteria, then we'll help you. But you have to fit me. And that was just not what we do with the Princeton students. So there seemed to be two different worlds, one of which I grew up in, and one of which didn't work. I mean, the richest people send their kids to Princeton. Why? Because the environment there is one that enforces and reinforces capability and provides for creativity and innovation and everything else, which we don't do for the bottom half of the world's population. We treat them as if somehow or other they need to wait for us.
And the Center for Peer-Driven Change, which evolved out of the Family Independence Initiative, it aims to spread resident-led efforts globally. Like you had mentioned, America, though far from perfect, is one of the best places to start this movement. It has an environment in which we can build upon to create, you know, what we eventually want, which is a near perfect society where we can take in people who are under the poverty line and give them the care that they need. Make it so that it is about them rather than, fitting us, like you had mentioned. And so, how do you adapt this model that may work in America to very different cultural and economic contexts around the world?
I guess that was my basic question. I started with family and realizing that, if you want to deal with my mother and friends that we had and whatever, you had to somehow back off from your paternalism and you thinking that you had the better solution and let them show their talents and that let them prove that they are resourceful. My mother was willing to invest in that dress shop, so she would have skin in the game, but there was no investment system for her to start that dress shop. And my Princeton students, there was actually, this might digress a little bit, but Um, After teaching that first year, I was put on this committee to mentor Princeton students and their business ventures, and there was of young people, young students there that wanted to build a business based on what would you call it? Clothing designs for angry young people. And so it was really interesting that then we were mentoring this group of basically dress designers and whatever that were just, and they were just starting this business and whatever, and they got a lot of support. And then later they could apply for actually an investment fund, an equity-like investment fund that Princeton had set up just for students and student ventures so they could practice and try to expand. So it's kind of a fascinating environment. And yet I saw my mother over 20 years then actually be a wonderful seamstress, a wonderful dress designer, wanting to shop. And somehow or other, even though she had a built-in clientele and she had talent and she had proved it, had nowhere to access the support and resources that the 19, 20-year-olds in Princeton had with no experience. And sitting there and looking at what we had available for people like my mother, and then what we made available for the privileged, it's like, no, this is not going to work. That focus on family, I start learning as I work internationally and as I look at our experience. Remember, I mentioned that when we went and lived in a tough neighborhood, my mother would try to find role models that were really positive. I start realizing that while individual families can be helped if you match their talents, my interest and what my mother's promise had been is that I don't let this happen to other people, not one other family, but other people. And so the issue became that of scale. We have four people struggling in and around poverty. They control so very little of the wealth of that. I think it's like 6 mostly American entrepreneurs control as much wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. It is a ridiculous split in terms of the wealth that's available. So we have all of these people, and that helping one family, that's not going to do it. So the issue for me then became, well, we learned from another family that my mother made sure I knew it could happen, that I could go to college. And that somehow or other, that role model was important. So my vision expanded from the Family Independence Initiative to then Community Independence Initiative to now the Center for Peer Driven, which is that if we want social change to scale, it actually requires a community. It requires a village. Your social networks to be supportive. That's what Princeton was. It's this huge social network of support, where you look on as capable. And what came out of that is this realization. If you think about um, emancipation of the slaves that are even before the slaves were emancipated in the US, that there were black that had evolved and actually were full economies, very small but full economies. And after emancipation, that somehow or other it starts spreading. And that former slave, no education, no support, no whatever, certainly no programs and no philanthropists, established within a decade dozens and then hundreds of small townships, all black townships. Slowly, I think Oklahoma had its own electric company. How did they come to learn and figure out how to run an electric company? They started the black colleges. There were barber shops or boarding houses, banks, all of these things from an uneducated population. And so intuitively, people have different talents and they can grow those. And it can be from any nationality, any part of the country, even if they've gone through and continue to go through oppression. But when they work together, is a supportive environment like what they built by being an all black township and trying to stay away from the oppressive society. when they work together, just like the Jewish community, the Amish community, the Irish, when they got into, when you work together, you become powerful. And today's version is what you saw yesterday, Saturday, when there was a lot of self-organizing to protest Trump. That wasn't driven by a Martin Luther King or whatever. That was driven because millions of people were against what Trump has been doing. And so they felt strong enough that they wanted to self-organize. The facilitation came from nonprofits. It came from structure. That's a facilitation, not a leadership. The leadership has to come from the social networks. And so my work at the Center for Peer-Driven Change is to try to actually get our systems and our leaders to recognize that when people self-organize, it means that it means something to them. They start taking ownership, and that what we need to do is provide an environment for that movement has to grow. That's the only way you can overpower people that are in presidential positions or authoritarians or dictators. It has to be movements of the people, of the real people. And that's how these communities have done it. And so that's what the center has really been focusing on. Is somehow or other, we need to build a global movement where half of the world's population that is really underinvested and seen as incapable, where they can start seeing each other, even across ethnicity or religion, as no, we actually share something in common that is deeper than religion and deeper than these fights that we're all getting into. We all want to feed our children. We all want to have the world be better for our children. And when I start bringing communities together from Liberia, the Philippines, and we've done that, when they start recognizing that they share that common goal of humanity, then they start actually seeing each other and breaking the stereotypes that we have of each other, and that unity can be built. And that's sort of what you're seeing across our country in that Saturday when, millions of people self. There are deeper things that can bring it together. And so we have to actually get away from the little things that keep dividing us and come together on this bigger piece. So my work now is global. We're getting some attention from the World Economic Forum and the Shaw Foundation, which brings in some of the, highest people in the world, Davos, and they will in January. And that somehow or other, people are realizing that the the programs and the top-down philanthropy and whatever that my generation set up helps people individually and helps, but is not going to be able to scale. It is not going to reach the 4 billion that are assets to the world. These are people like my mother and our neighbors that have talents, and they can grow the economy. It's not going to take away from their privilege. The privileged are afraid that if somebody from India comes, that they're going to take the job away from an American. And it's not that. It's that they can grow the economy. And that's what we need is Africa, for instance, which is where main project is in Liberia, is a huge potential of 50 some countries that can actually grow their own economies and take care of themselves and add to the world. I think in many ways, I've seen how India has grown. I saw how China has grown and whatever, that can happen. And then you start looking at what are the elements? Well, one is investment, but that's not the key. The key is when people start working together. So it's got to go back to that. So that's really what our focus on at this point in time.
I actually recently interviewed Kevin Adler, who told me about an idea of relational poverty during interaction that he had with an unhoused individual who had said that he didn't realize he was homeless when he lost his house, but he realized when he was homeless when he didn't have a network, when he didn't have any friends, he didn't have someone to rely on, he didn't have someone to talk to. And I think that's a common thread that has been throughout all of my podcasts, and especially through this one, which is the necessity of a community, necessity of partnerships, the necessity to have someone else that you can rely on, even to just talk to, but also to be able to expand your talents, to be able to work off of each other, because we as humans, we rely on that social connection. We can't thrive alone. We need our siblings, we need our friends, we need our parents, we need the people who make us show up every single day and make us be the best versions of ourselves that we possibly can be. And speaking of these partnerships, I want to delve a little bit deeper into the Center of Peer Driven Change and the expansion of the organization, because going on to this mass level that you've now attained, obviously partnerships with not only among different peers who are helping each other, but with governments, nonprofits, businesses, they must have played a key role in the growth of your organization. And so I want to ask what kind of these partnerships were most useful and how were they useful?
Okay, here's where it gets real humorous. I got into this work in 2001 in exploring this whole thing about what is the capability of families and social networks to expand. And so that was what, 2001? I forget how many years that is now. But um, in that exploration, I was finding that uh, change could happen and the families were capable. And so I felt that what I needed to do was look at the role of government and philanthropy and programs, et cetera. And so I spent a lot of time trying to forge partnerships and um, trying to get philanthropy to support this and whatever. I can tell you after 20, 25 years, it's ridiculous. Uh, it is not really happening at kind of scale. There is now a sense that it happened with Schwab and some other supporters at a high level, understanding that after 45 years, at least in my experience, that our current system of organizations and government are not helping. If anything, the gap between the rich and the poor has gotten bigger, and the concentration of wealth is continuing to go really quickly. Something is fundamentally wrong, and there are now enough people. And it has been a system that my generation set up of organizations and government and philanthropy. Finally, understanding that that system, what our initiative is trying to do is get them to step back and give up the power to lead. We're asking these Princeton students that are being told every day to lead, asking them, no, your leadership, your understanding is not going to help. You're showing up at my mother's doorstep is not going to do it. You know, if you want to be helpful, you're going to have to learn about her and what drives her and support her. You're going to have to follow the resonance. That is not a message that the privileged get. And yet the privileged are the ones in government, philanthropy, business, you name it. So what I've come to learn after 20, 25 years on the ground is that message to the system that holds power right now, my generation that holds power, best intended. Seriously, they don't want to give up power to lead. I mean, even as you explained your background and you want to do something, you want to develop an app, you want to develop ideas, new solar panels, new toilets. You know, I can't tell you how many ideas come that are that you know Africa really needs this, and yet when those ideas are brought in from outsiders into these countries, they don't stick. But you know what is stuck? Is I went into Liberia and I did this in Detroit and I did this in 6 different cities in the US. I go into these neighborhoods now and I go into talk groups and I say, look at, I'm you know that. And you know that we outsiders have brought in many programs. In Liberia, there's been tons of programs from USA, nonprofits, and whatever. And they have great ideas, but have things fundamentally changed for you? And the people would say, no. I said, but they did all these things and they have all this data, but it hasn't fundamentally changed. As I said, no. And I said, yeah, you're right. It hasn't. My experience is that somehow or other it does, and that there's something wrong. And so the reason I'm here is that I think that you, the residents here, have the solution. And what we're about is we're here to try to learn So if you think you have better ideas or you can lead it better than all these outsiders that have been showing up for this, then now is your time to do it. This is a challenge to you. So you step up. And you step up and come up with things that are supportable, that I could support. I will really try to support you. Minimally, I'll recognize and I'll bring your ideas to the World Economic Forum. I'll show them to the world because I do think you have the better ideas. My mother had better ideas in terms of our family, and our friends had the better ideas. So this is your chance. And what we do, our role will be to collect the data, verify what you're doing, our role. And we can document it and we can spread your message. And that what we want to do is then have that message spread to other neighbors, to other cities, to other countries. So if you come in and you have better ideas, which we think you do, you now, my mother told me, you have a responsibility to then pass along. Peer to peer is the way it's going to change. Outside coming in, it's not. But if you start succeeding and you start doing something, you have now a responsibility, which is my mother told me, you now have the responsibility to pass it forward. You have to take it to Sierra Leone. You have to take it to the Philippines. Our role will be to facilitate that and to collect the data and verify so that trust can be built. And when I've done that, whether it's in Detroit or Latvia, the message is totally clear. Where people in privileged positions won't accept that, when I go into a community and say that, well, sure, we'll we'll do it. We'll take the initiative. And so in Liberia, 10,000 people have signed up basically on the value system that they will help others. And it came from a fact that what we did is I provided to some of the libraries the type of support that Princeton provided for its students. I told you that the little investment fund that would encourage people to come up with projects and business and whatever. So we set up some challenge grants. And we said, okay, so you come up with business plans. We're going to train you how to do a business plan. You just have to answer these 5 questions. And you have to, however, convince a committee that your project will work, that you have your own money in it, that you're going to lead it. This is what my prison students have to do. When you do that, if it's something we'll support, we'll try to support it. So initially we started with like 6 or 8 business plans and we funded 4. There were 2 cleaning up water wells. It was really interesting. They did it mostly to help others, to help themselves, because it was the primary business plan to clean up the waters and provide toilets. So all of a sudden, we thought they would go for solar or whatever. There wasn't any of the other stuff. So they succeeded. And after they succeeded, we got like 10 business plans. And then we funded a few of those. And next thing we knew, we got 18 business plans. Again, we didn't do outreach, it's word of mouth spreading. And now we have over 50. And we said, stop sending us business plans. We don't have the funding to support those. But the capability is there. It's been hidden for ages. It's been hidden for all time because our sector does not go and ask them what they can do and ask them to lead. Our sector comes and says, we have this really nice seed that's going to be great for you, and we have all these ideas and whatever. So the challenge that we provide to the students at Princeton and that we provide to the families is what can grow. And so our heaviest concentration is sort of like the anti-jump protests. It's like you're going to have to self-organize. The rich do this. They go to Mar-a-Lago to cut deals. They go to charity balls to cut deals. They network. That's what you're going to have to do. This is not about an individual. This is about community. And what I see growing in Liberia is, and that's what we're going to heavily participate support, is a movement of peer-to-peer driven change that actually is already starting and actually was always there in the background. When you think about the like townships, the Jewish community, you think about how Other communities that are very strong have really expanded and used that base of community to share the wealth for mutuality, for mutual support, and to provide a vision for the next set of generations.
And you often highlight the power of self-renewing communities, like you described in Liberia, where these people have their talents and with a little bit of, you know, yeah, a little bit of push, they're able to, show off these talents and prove that they don't need sort of outsiders to come in and force an idea upon them that they now have to take in, use or pursue. If they have their own idea, which they do, and they've proven to do so, they can really use that idea, build that idea, and it can become successful. And trusting the talent of these communities is something that you've emphasized a lot. And so, what examples today, besides obviously the one that you just described and the ones that occur in your own organization, give you hope that this approach is truly spreading?
So I'm actually going to take you in history to my lesson, my greatest lesson, which is probably started in 2001. What we did is to test. I told you that Mayor Jerry Brown, who then became governor of California, he supported this idea of okay, well, let's go learn from these families. And so what I did is that very first cultural independence initiative type of project. What I did is I recruited families I had known from the Black community, from the Hispanic community, and from the Asian community, because that's the way that the communities kind of broke down. And essentially, the way it worked that I got a group of Salvadoran refugees. Okay, and in trying to find these communities, I would identify one or two families from these sets of communities that I'd known for decades at that point in time. I said, "Look at, we want to learn from you. Jerry Brown is there; he wants to learn from you also." And that what you have to do though is that never made it herself. She needed other people, and she needed the strength of that. And so you have to recruit anywhere from 5 to 10 of your friends, and I will only include you into this project where we're going to learn from you as a group. No individuals, it's as a group. And so we had two communities that self-organized in the Black community, one in the Salvadoran refugee community, and one in the Asian community, which were refugees from the war in Vietnam. And the most fascinating thing happened was that our staff could only listen. We would provide no help, no ideas, and whatever. This is about the capability. Remember, at this point in time, I didn't realize how capable these communities really were. I carried some of the same stereotypes as everybody else, and we're just going to learn, right? What happened was that with the Salvadoran community, my staff liaison would sit on their meetings because we did ask them to meet once a month so that we could understand. Again, we're trying to learn what was happening in the month previous. And so one of the families that they were going to buy a house. They were probably considered the least capable of all the families in the group of buying. And they said, well, there's this Spanish speaking real estate agent that told us they could help us buy the house at the end of the block and da da da. And we believe him and whatever. And my staff came back and said, we think they're stuck with a predatory lender. And it's like, can you say something? And I'm over there, no, you can't say anything. I promised the mayor that we would learn. And my mother made mistakes, and so we're going to have to do it. Admittedly, though, it was hard for me to tell myself not to intervene. And so, sure enough, this family started going down the road to buy this house, and they did end up getting the house. But this guy put in mortgage insurance and all kinds of stuff. And what it turns out is that their payments with all the that he had it 60% of their income because we were taking their income. Remember, we collect data from these families. That's how we learn. That's all the projects always collect data. I was an engineer and I love data. But when we looked at it, here's their mortgage payments and everything else. 60% of my staff comes back is that they can't survive. They can't keep the house. They're going to have to sell it. And all of us felt really bad, and so then it's like, well, let's see what happens. Well, what happens is somewhere along the line, this family realized being taken advantage of, but they already had money into the deal to get, whatever or whatever. And so they made sure, however, the refinance clause in the whole thing. And so what after they bought the house, they talked to their community and they said, we need your help. They retiled it, relanced it, repainted the whole thing. And by doing all these improvements, they put the value of the house up. They had it reevaluated and they refinanced. And they asked me to sit in on the refinance because they didn't trust anybody, and they had built trust with us because we don't interfere, because we basically said, we think you can figure it out. And sure enough, by refinancing, they got their payments out about 40%. And when it's at that level, surrounded by these set of friends, there's no way they're going to lose that house. And as of the last time I checked, which was probably 15 years ago, they still own the house. The next thing that happened is that was Family Independence Initiative. The thing that happened is that the other four families in that group realized that this family that had really figured out how to get a house owned a house. Within 18 months, all the other families owned homes in the United States. Once they knew it could be done and that they didn't have to make the same mistake, all went after it. And they all pooled their money, they brought their friends or whatever. So the entire group owned homes in the United States. So that peer-to-peer effect was really there. Okay, so that was like fascinating to us. And so it's a story that I would tell at every lecture. 15 years later, I'm telling this story at Stanford in a lecture to a large audience. And after I get to the end of the lecture, Salvadoran man comes up to me and he says, so, my mother heard about your families doing that. And so our family bought a house. And it's the equity from that house that is getting me to Stanford. 15 years later, that model had penetrated that community and went from generation to generation. That's how the Irish did it. That's how the Rich do it, and whatever. That's what we need because they own that solution. They knew it. So that was my biggest aha. It's like, damn, this can really go much further. So that's really, in terms of communities nowadays, I think the same thing happening in so many places, but it's hidden because the nonprofit sector and the philanthropists do not go into communities and ask, what are you doing that's right? Why are you graduating? They don't go in that way. They go in and the RFPs from philanthropists and governments, what is the need? What is wrong? How are you, as the privileged, going to solve it? We come into these communities totally backward. And so therefore it hides all of the efforts that actually and talents that my mother and our friends and generations have. And we need to flip the coin. And I just did a lecture at Columbia, to class at Columbia University. And what's interesting is that after 20, 25 years, he said, so, I'm starting to hear about that. I'm starting to hear that really we're going to have to listen to residents. And yeah. And that you not only have to listen, you're going to have to back off. You have power. They know you have power. And because they know you have power, they will step back. You will never really see what they're capable of until you flip that coin. And the families that we work with know that the only way I will show success for the Center for Peer-Driven Change is if they lead the change. If they do nothing, nothing happens, and therefore I get no credit. So it is the power and the leadership. So it's not support. It's actually really pushing for the leadership of these families to self-organize a protest, organize cleaning up a water well, whatever it is that's really important to them. We have to learn as a sector of privilege how to be follower leaders, how to be servant leaders. Our privileged people are not taught that way. Gen Z has to start looking at it very, very differently. Okay, so those that was kind of my parting message at that Columbia class lecture.
And looking ahead to the next generation, to Gen Z, what advice would you give to young people or grassroots groups trying to tackle social inequities in their own communities?
The first thing is don't look to my generation. I have friends that are in Congress or office and philanthropy and you name it, and they will give you a message that is opposite. Well intended. I mean, really, I mean, these are our friends that some of them won't talk to me now. Because I tell them you have to step back. You're going to have to trust. You're going to have to be dependent on families. And, if you want to send your kids to, you're privileged, you want to send your kids to college, the system won't accept it. You won't get funding. It's difficult for us to get funding because we basically say to the philanthropist, no, we don't know what the families are going to do, but we know they'll do something that means something to them. That step is just being recognized. And so for this next generation, you're going to have to take a step back. Do not just fall into traditional nonprofits. You want to do crisis at the UN and whatever, it is really important you do that. But if you want to really fundamental start closing the gap between the rich and the poor, if you want to have enough power to really fight the power to be, it can only be done with movements of real people on the ground, and they're going to have to trust you. So you're going to have to be a servant leader. So yes, the next generation, don't follow the system that my generation set up.
Peer-driven change. That is definitely the common thread throughout this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mauricio Miller. It has been an honor to interview you, and thank you so much for sharing your experience and your wonderful words about your organization and what the future holds.
Thank you so much. I've been really enjoying it and hope to we stay connected. Take care. Bye bye.